All right. Well, welcome to session 2 of the Biblical Worldview course. My name is Joel Sedekase, and I'm coming to you from about 50 miles west of Chicago in the Fox Valley region. And we are here tonight to talk about how to make sense of the world. How should Christians make sense of the world? How do we make sense of this thing that we call reality or human experience? So, if you're just watching now, this is session 2, and I want to encourage you to go back and watch session 1, which is posted on YouTube, and you can access on my website or on the Think Institute website, I should say. And you can get that by going to thethink.institute. I'll put that up on the screen, that address. If you're listening to this later on the podcast, I want to thank you for listening. If you're watching on YouTube or somewhere else, we put out a lot of content like this around the biblical worldview and apologetics and how to share your faith and engage others with the gospel, because we believe that no follower of Jesus Christ should ever get caught flat-footed when asked about what or why we believe. And so what do? We seek to help dads lead their families in defending the Christian message. That is what we are all about at the Think Institute. So without any further ado, I'm going to give you some information at the end as to how you can partner with us and join our team, join the mission of the Think Institute. But we need to jump into this content because we've got guys watching backstage right now as we speak who are enrolled in this course. Now, we put these courses on through the Hammer and Anvil Society, which is our discipleship wing of the Think Institute. And if you want to know more about the course, again, you can get that information at our website, especially if you go to thethink.institute/worldview. You can actually still join the course if you feel so inclined, or you can watch the videos or listen to the episodes later. So let's jump in. Let's talk about what is around you right now. So look around you. What do you see? Okay, as I look around me, I see I've got a laptop, a desk. My phone is in the vicinity. What about you? If you look outside, maybe you see a tree, clouds, stars. What is all that stuff? What is all that stuff? Now, that might seem like kind of a silly question, kind of almost a question that's too trivial to even ask. What do you mean? What is all that stuff? The desk is a desk. The tree is a tree. It might seem absurdly basic to ask yourself the question, what is all that stuff? But if you really think about it, it's a question that bears asking. And there are philosophers who have dedicated their lives to answering that question. What is stuff? What is it? What is it all? There was a famous philosopher, Socrates, who said that the unexamined life is not worth living. So examine your experience. Examine what's around you. In fact, let's take the tree, for example, that hypothetical tree that's outside your window. How do you explain what the tree is? How do you make sense of the tree? It's a tree, but what is that tree? To explain it, you might want to go small. Here's what I mean. You might want to break it up. And you say, well, the tree is made up of parts. Okay, you've got branches and leaves, roots. If you go even internally, you've got, xylem and phloem and sap. But really, if you get down to the molecular or to the microscopic level, a tree is made up of cells, plant cells, not animal cells, plant cells. And those cells are made up of constituent parts as well. There's the nucleus of the cell, and then of course there's all these other parts of the cell. But those parts are made up of proteins and DNA, aren't they? And proteins and DNA, those are molecules. Well, molecules, we could go even smaller than what are molecules? Molecules are made up of atoms that are bonded together. What are atoms? Well, if you remember your high school chemistry course, you've got different parts of the atom. You've got the nucleus, which is made up of protons and neutrons, and then there are electrons, which circle and orbit around in a cloud around the nucleus, the nuclei. And okay, so is that what a tree is? A tree is protons and neutrons? Well, no, because you can go even smaller than that. Protons and neutrons and electrons, these are made up of smaller parts that we call quarks. There are up quarks and down quarks. And those quarks, what are the quarks made up of? Well, if you go down small enough, there are different theories, competing theories about what everything is made up of. String theory says everything's made up of strings, and the way that these strings vibrate is what gives everything mass. It's where matter comes from. And then recently, it was in the news that there was something called the Higgs boson, which has been hypothesized to be what's been called sometimes the God particle, because it gives meaning to everything. It gives everything its substance. John Frame, in his book, We Are All Philosophers, one of my favorite theologians, says, in my unscientific way, I want to know what the strings are made of. And me, Joel Sedekase, I want to know something similar. I want to know, what are the Higgs bosons made up of? It doesn't seem like you've really explained anything. You've just broken quarks and other particles down into a smaller part. But what are those parts made out of? And John Frame, in his book, We Are All Philosophers, what he says is, ultimately, what many are saying now is that there is no fundamental particle. You can't go down small enough. As a matter of fact, when you go down to the subatomic level, or even the level of photons and protons and neutrons, what you might be dealing with might not actually be real particles at all, but something like pointers for the way that our meters read things. Now, this is getting really almost esoteric. You almost feel like you've gone into the quantum realm of the Ant-Man movies or the Avengers movies. What exists at that level, and can we even talk about it in a meaningful way? Well, here's what we can know. When you get down to that kind of level, that subatomic level, there are no answers there about our tree. Remember, we started this whole thing trying to figure out what our tree is. Going down to the subatomic level does not give meaning to what the tree is. It doesn't actually tell us anything fundamental. All it tells us is that you can break things down into smaller and smaller parts, but there's nothing about a Higgs boson that tells me anything about a tree other than just, it's made up of Higgs bosons, I guess. So let's go in the other direction. Let's try to explain the tree in terms of the categories that it fits into, in terms of the relationships that it has categorically with other things that are like it. So we'll go macro. Okay, instead of going micro, which is what we just did, we're going to go macro. All right, so let's think about the tree in terms of categories. So in my backyard, I've got a maple tree. And it's one maple tree, just one tree. It's distinct from other trees. It's an individual entity in that regard, but it's a maple tree. In that sense, it's got similar qualities and attributes to other maple trees. So we're going to put it in the maple tree category. And maybe that's going to give us some insight into what it is. Okay. And then that, of course, raises the question, well, what are maple trees? Well, maple trees, that's a type of tree. There are maple trees, there are oak trees, there are birch trees, there are palm trees, although palm trees really aren't trees at all. I think they're actually a grass. They're a type of grass. Some of you guys who live down south can let me know if that's accurate, but I believe palm trees aren't even actually technically trees. Okay, so they're out of the tree category, but there are other trees that do fit into the tree category. So maybe we ought to think about trees in terms of their distinct and discrete parts. Maybe we ought to think of them in terms of wholeness, oneness. Let's try and lump all the trees together into categories. We'll say this is tree. This is treeness. What do all these trees have in common? And we're going to analyze treeness, and that's going to give us meaning to our tree. But here's the thing. We're going big. So why stop at treeness? Because trees, that's a type of plant. It's a type of the plantae kingdom. And plants all have certain things in common, don't they? They've got cell walls in common. They've got certain attributes. They've got chlorophyll. They make their own food. So we're thinking in terms of plants. Maybe we ought to go even bigger than plants, because plants are one of the kingdoms of life. There's plantae kingdom, animalia kingdom. So maybe we got to think of just our tree in terms of not only in the plant kingdom, but in terms of living things as distinct from non-living things. So we've got life and non-life. But then there are certain things that sort of blur those categories, like a virus. Is a virus technically alive? Yes and no. It's actually debated. And there are even certain entities which it's not clear what kingdom they really fall into. So maybe we ought to think in terms not just of living and unliving, but maybe just, living and unliving things all have something in common. They're all material. So maybe we ought to just think in terms of material things. Maybe that's our ultimate category that's going to give meaning to that tree in the backyard. But now at this point, what are we talking about? Haven't we gone so broad that we're just talking about stuff? Does it really make sense to say that thinking of our tree in terms of just being stuff, being material, being matter, does that really tell us anything about the tree? So here's the dilemma we run into. When we examine the tree or the desk or the laptop or anything else in our experience, if we examine it in terms of itself and we go smaller and smaller, it ultimately gives us no answers. If we go bigger and broader and think categorically, it still ultimately gives us no answers. We are left in this predicament. When we examine human experience, the cosmos, the world around us, in terms of itself, it doesn't give us any answers. Whether we go small, we can call that atomism, thinking of everything in terms of its constituent parts, atom, which comes from a Greek term meaning unchoppable. Here's how I remember that. A is a prefix that negates something. So amoral is something that is just not moral. Okay. Tom means non-choppable. How do you remember choppable? What does a tomahawk do? Chops. Okay, so an atom is I'm very much mixing cultures and languages here, okay? But I'm an American, I'm free to do that. We're a melting pot. So I just triggered everyone. So the atomism thinks of things in terms of going into smaller and smaller pieces. Holism is the term that John Frame uses to describe HOLISM is the John Frame term for thinking of things in terms of bigger and bigger categories. But neither one will give us ultimate answers about reality. But the question that we need to answer, and this is the first question in our study of worldviews, is what is real? Or we might say, what is really real? That's the question that we are trying to answer. And appealing to an atomistic view or a holistic view does not give us the answers. What is stuff? What is reality? What is prime reality? Now, this study of reality, the study of what is ultimately real, is often known by the name metaphysics. Where do we get the name metaphysics from? Well, in a sense, it kind of makes sense because we're thinking about meta in the Greek means with or after, and metaphysics is sort of the study of what's after physics, what's behind the physical world, what's behind what we can see. But in reality, when the ancient philosophers came up with this term, they just happened to, they needed a term for the body of writing. I think it was Socrates. No, it must have been Aristotle's writings that they were collating, that they were arranging. And it just so happened that his study of prime reality came after his study of the physical world. And so they just called it after physics, meaning it literally just came later in the notebook. It came later in the papers. So they called it metaphysics. And to this day, we still call it metaphysics. It's the study of what is ultimately real. Bound up with the study of metaphysics is the study of ontology. Ontology is the study of being. So when we talk about ontology, we're talking about what is, what has existence. And we're talking metaphysics, we're talking about what is prime reality, what is really real, what is ultimate reality like, what is stuff, what is real. And this question of prime reality has been a live question ever since the time of the ancient Greeks, ever since Heraclitus said all is fire and Thales said all is water. It's been a live question ever since the 5 and 600s BC. Now, there are other questions bound up with this question of prime reality. And these three questions are going to be what we really talk about in this lesson. There are these three philosophical problems that we want to try and answer. Because when we examine human experience, here's what we find. There are different kinds of reality. Different types of reality have different attributes. So, for example, when we examine our world, when we examine reality, here's what we discover. Certain things exist necessarily, or at least they seem to. Other things have contingent existence. And there's this weird interplay and dichotomy between necessary and contingent existence. When I talk about necessary existence, I'm talking about things that it sure seems like they would have to exist in every possible world. An obvious example of this would be the laws of logic. The laws of logic are the law of non-contradiction. Two contradictory statements can't both be true in the same sense at the same time in the same way. The law of identity, which says A is A. A thing is itself, which seems obvious, but that's a law. It's obvious because it's a law. It's a law because it's obvious. And the law of excluded middle. A or not A, nothing in between. A statement is either true or false, one or the other. Okay, those laws of logic exist in every possible world. And if you want to say, well, that's a Western way of thinking about things, that's not necessarily true. I could imagine a possible world in which logic didn't obtain logic. The laws of logic weren't necessarily true. Well, guess what? In a world like that, where the laws of logic weren't necessarily true, then it would be true that the laws of logic aren't true. And in that world, it would not be true that the laws of logic were true. So you see, you still have an interplay. You still have a law of logic operative there. The law of non-contradiction still applies in that world. Unless you're going to say, in a world in which logic is not true, logic is true in that world. Well, now you're right back to having a world where logic is true. So the laws of logic exist necessarily. And that's perplexing to philosophers, to thinkers. So certain things exist necessarily. They're immaterial. Laws aren't made out of matter. But we also have things that exist contingently. Contingent meaning they depend on something else for their existence. Conditions have to be right for these things to obtain, for these things to exist. I'll give you an example. You and me. We don't exist necessarily. I can certainly imagine a world in which Nick Smelser doesn't exist. It might not be a great world. I'm sure his wife and kids are certainly glad that he exists, but I can imagine a world in which he doesn't. He can imagine a world in which I don't. We don't exist necessarily. Conditions had to be right. Our parents had to come together. There are our great-grandparents. There was a lot of conditions that had to obtain, that had to happen first before we could exist. Matter, I can imagine a world with no matter, just a big empty world. There are things that exist contingently. And one of the great philosophical problems is which one gives rise to which? Do the laws of logic necessarily give rise to contingent things like matter? Do necessary laws like morality, like where it's always wrong, to murder, can that give rise to something like a murderer? No, the necessary laws that exist necessarily don't have any causal power. And yet here we have all these contingent things that exist. And these contingent things seem to be governed by the necessarily existent laws. There's an interplay, there's an interaction between the two of them. How do we explain this? This is a philosophical problem. It's one that we have to explain. There are these aspects to reality, to real reality, that we have to explain. Your worldview has to account for this. The next philosophical problem is oneness and diversity. Oneness and diversity. You've heard those terms before, haven't you? As a matter of fact, it sounds to some of you like I'm about to launch into a corporate training program because you've been through oneness and diversity trainings at your workplace. Oneness and diversity. It's a very hot topic right now. Everyone wants to know about oneness and diversity. How do we make these diverse things one? And how do we make this one entity, this team, this company, this whatever, respectful of the unique and diverse entities and individuals that make up the whole? How do we account for oneness and diversity? And furthermore, what is more prime? What is more primary? What is more ultimate in the world? Is it oneness or is it diversity? Or we might say plurality. Is it the one or is it the many? Is everything fundamentally one, as the Eastern religions say? Or is everything ultimately just a bunch of discrete parts, like materialism would say? We're just a bunch of atoms. We're just a bunch of cells. We're just a bunch of proteins. We're nothing really ultimately more than the sum of our parts. This is a philosophical problem, oneness and diversity. And finally, the problem of mind and matter. Mind and matter. Now this is a corker. This is a real interesting one. As the Brits say, this is a real barnstormer. Why? Because in reality, we seem to have something like mind. I'm thinking. And I recently had a little debate discussion. I don't know if it was little, it was an hour long, with a guy named Tom Jump. He's a self-proclaimed atheist. I say self-proclaimed because if you know anything about me, I don't believe in atheists. That's a whole nother story. But what he said was that he's banking everything on Descartes' cogito, and I always mispronounce that word. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And there are many people who believe that you can ground your experience, your explanation of experience, in the fact that here you are a self and you exist. And therefore, from that, you can extrapolate out all kinds of principles about the world. Okay. You start with your own mind. And then from there, you can reason about reality. Here's the thing. While that might seem self-evident to some, or even to many, or even to most, there are those who question that principle. I'll give you an example. I don't know if he's directly questioned Descartes, but Sam Harris, the famous or maybe infamous atheist, says that the self is actually an illusion. There is no self. Yeah, I know you feel like you're a self. It's false. You're not a self. You know who else says that? Hinduism. Hinduism says that the self is ultimately an illusion, as are all distinctions between entities. And yet here we are thinking about whether or not we have minds. It almost seems nonsensical, doesn't it? But how do we explain the interplay and the coexistence of mind and matter? There are different ways people explain this. Some go towards panpsychism. They say everything has mind. Others say that the mind or the self is really just ultimately an illusion. How do we make sense of mind and matter? It's a philosophical problem that we need to explain if we're going to talk about metaphysics. All right, now because this is a biblical worldview course, we really ought to talk about how the biblical worldview answers these questions. And thank God, as Christians, we aren't left to speculate. We have a key, and that key is found in Scripture. And the key is so obvious when you understand what it is. It's so stinking obvious. You're going to wonder how the Greeks never came up with this. You're going to wonder how Sam Harris doesn't see this, or how the Tom Jumps of the world miss this. You're going to wonder how you never saw it before, if you've never seen it before. The answer is located in Genesis 1:1. What does Genesis 1:1 say? If you need to look it up, go ahead. But here's what it says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, right here, what we're getting more than just an origin story. We're getting the true perspective on the world. We're getting the fundamental distinction between types of reality. There are ultimately, fundamentally, two different types of reality. There is creator and there is creation. There is creator and there is creation. And here's the big idea of today's lesson, of today's class. The key to understanding the cosmos, the world, human experience, the key to understanding it all is not to examine the parts in relation to themselves, or even the parts in relation to the whole, but rather to consider it all, sum and part, in relation to its creator. The key to understanding reality is to consider the created world in relation to its creator. So in Genesis 1:1, we have this creation creator distinction, which is the most fundamental distinction in all of reality. There is God and there is not God. And the not God was created by God. We get this in Genesis 1, but of course, we don't only get it in Genesis 1. We also get it throughout Scripture, but we get it in John chapter 1, verse 3. John chapter 1, verse 3 reaffirms the distinction between creation and creator. And interestingly and importantly, it also brings in verses 1 through 3 also bring in the Logos, who we find out later is the Son of God, Jesus Christ, into the equation. Here's what John chapter 1, verse 3 says about the Logos, about the Word, who we ultimately know as Jesus. It says, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. I'll read it one more time. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Again, we've got this distinction. We've got all of reality divided into two categories, the things that were made and the things that were not made. The things that were made were all made through Jesus. They were all made through Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ is on the uncreated side. So what that means is any worldview that says that Jesus Christ is an angel or a celestial or the first and greatest of God's creations is right off the bat is unbiblical and false. Okay, because all reality is divided up into created, creation, and creator, and Jesus is on the creator side. He is God. It's a very important distinction because when you are engaging in apologetics, when you're engaging when you're having discussions with people about their worldview, you are going to run into people who have this view that Jesus is created by God. But that's unbiblical. If you're going to think about Jesus, you have to think of him in biblical terms. Okay, so when we think of creation in terms of the creator, we suddenly have answers to all of our philosophical problems. All right, let's think first. Let's think about unity and diversity. Remember in the beginning we were talking about our tree and we were trying to explain the tree in terms of its parts and then in terms of the categories into which it fits. We went micro first and then we went macro. Well, according to the biblical worldview, the world is not merely the sum of its parts. Everything is not merely particles. Atomism is false. Nor, on the other hand, is everything all one, such that we could, lump all reality into into just everything is one, as if we were pantheists, or as if we subscribed to a sort of Hindu monism. We'll talk more about that at the end. Everything is not parts because unlike in atomism, where everything is just broken down and there's no ultimate meaning unifying everything together, the Bible gives us meaning for those parts and explains how the parts fit together into meaningful wholes. But it's not as though the whole itself is just this amorphous spiritual or material blob of oneness. There are meaningful distinctions. There is real unity reflected in the reality around us. So it does make sense to speak in terms of categories, to speak in terms of laws. Okay, we don't have to speak and analyze each tree individually. We can think in terms of trees and treeness. Okay, this is very important for science. We can perform experiments on one type of tree and we can extrapolate out principles and laws about all trees, just as an example. On the other hand, there is real distinction and diversity and uniqueness and individuality in reality. Personhood is real. The self is real, not merely illusory. So if we describe man in general, we still have a long way to go before we understand an individual person. And All you married men will vouch for this. You can't think you know what your wife wants just because you know what all women are like. Something like that. You need to get to know your wife. And for you single guys watching this, getting to know your prospective wife is an adventure. It's a roller coaster. And guess what? The process does not end when you get married. It's a lifelong process. Why? Because the self is real. We are real individuals. Okay, we can think in terms of women, men, humanity, those broad categories, but then there's this beautifully cool adventure where we get to investigate individual persons, individual selves. We get to look at actual discrete individual entities. So if we only try to understand reality in terms of reality itself, whether the parts or the whole, we will fail to understand it at all. If we only look at the parts, we won't understand the unifying principles that give meaning to those parts. If we only look at facts, we will never get to laws. Cornelius Van Til famously said that without God, we're left with just a bunch of discrete brute facts and laws that have no connection to those facts. And he compared it brilliantly, I think, to a whole bunch of pearls with no holes in them and a string with no beginning and no end. The string is like the law. The pearls are like the facts. There's no way to make that necklace. There's no way to thread those pearls and make a pearl necklace. We need some way of interacting the facts and the laws together, the categories and the individual entities, or we'll never understand reality as it actually is. So those three philosophical problems that I told you about earlier, it turns out that they are all solved when we start, not with just looking at creation, trying to understand it on its own terms, but rather when we start with God. And when we start specifically with two things, two attributes of God. The Bible calls them his invisible attributes that are clearly seen. Those two attributes are his eternal power and his divine nature. When we start with the eternal power and the divine nature of God as the foundation for our metaphysic, as the foundation for our worldview, as the key that is going to unlock the treasure trove of understanding of this universe, those three philosophical problems are solved. And so let's look at that. Let's look at how starting with God's eternal power and divine nature explains reality, answers the question of what is real, what is really real, and how we can make sense of the world starting with God. Okay, let's do that. Let's remember those three questions that we asked earlier. I'll pull those up on the screen if you're watching. Those three problems are the problem of the necessary versus the contingent, the problem of oneness versus diversity, and the problem of mind versus matter. Okay, so how do we answer those three questions from the biblical worldview? All right, let's start with the first one, the problem of the necessary versus the contingent. Contingent experience versus necessary experience. What do you think? How does the biblical worldview answer this problem? Okay. When we think about necessary existence, we're thinking in terms of the laws of logic, which exist in all possible worlds, and contingent things, which might not exist in some possible worlds. Well, these are explained by God's eternal power and his divine nature. Here's how. God's eternal power explain how all this matter got here, all this contingent stuff. You know, it's one of the great scientific and philosophical problems is where did everything come from? Where did all this matter and this energy come from? One of the laws of science, one of the conditions for making sense scientifically of the world is this problem of, or I guess It's more of a principle of the conservation of matter and energy. Matter can turn into energy, energy can turn back into matter, but matter and energy in total is never created nor destroyed. Well, God's eternal power explains that. There was a time when there was no contingent matter. There was a possible world in which there was no contingent matter. So this is how we know matter is contingent. From a biblical worldview, it makes perfectly good sense to describe things in terms of their contingency, meaning the conditions had to be right for these things to exist. There was a world in which matter did not exist. Before God created the world, there was no heavens, there was no earth. In the beginning, at the beginning of creation, at the beginning of physical time, the timeline in which we are, God created the heavens and the earth. So only God's eternal power can make sense of how you can get something from nothing. The Bible says that God created everything ex nihilo, from nothing. And how can God do that? Well, God can do everything he wants to do. God is totally sovereign, totally powerful. And I explain that to my kids when I catechize them using my catechism called Catechids. We say, how did God make everything out of nothing by his word? How can God make everything from nothing? God can do everything he wants to do. He has eternal power. Well, and then his divine nature explains why the laws of logic, for example, govern all thought and experience. Those laws of logic are real. The laws of mathematics, which are immaterial, are real. They do govern the world. How do they govern the world? How can these abstract entities, these propositions like A is A, how can that have any bearing on the physical world? So that, I'm holding up a pen right now. This pen is this pen. There is an instantiation of the law of logic in the way I must think about the pen in my hand or about the tree in my backyard. How can that be? What brings together the laws of logic and the material world? What brings together the necessarily existent things and the contingently existent things? It's God. God's divine nature is logical. God's divine nature is moral. And God's eternal power created all the matter in the world. So God's eternal power and divine nature are both part of who he is. And it makes sense then that if that God is going to create the world, that there would be perfect interweaving and connection between the results of his eternal power and divine nature, between the contingent matter and the necessarily existent laws governing all of creation. Isn't that amazing? This is why Albert Einstein needed to know Jesus. Here's why. Because Albert Einstein was flabbergasted by the fact that there was correspondence between the math in his mind and the way that math actually played out in the real world. He could not make sense of it. As Christians, we can. We understand that the linchpin holding it all together is God's eternal power and divine nature. Now, what about oneness and diversity? Which one of these is ultimate? Which one is more? Which one takes priority? Is it oneness? Everything is ultimately one? Or is it diversity? We are all unique. Well, from the biblical worldview, we don't have to say either one is ultimate. In fact, they are both equally ultimate to each other. Which is more ultimate, facts or laws? Categories or individual entities? Neither one. Neither unity nor plurality is ultimate. Rather, they are equally ultimate because this world in which we live was created by the triune God. The triune God. Not just some monad, not just some Unitarian God, but the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Why is that important? Because God's very nature, remember, his divine nature is going to be explaining all this. So his divine nature he's not just all powerful. He's not just perfectly good, but he is three and one. Triune means three and one. So doesn't it make sense that God's creation would have oneness and plurality expressed in it? There is real diversity in creation. And yet there is a unity and a wholeness and a cohesion and a sensibility that we can, an intelligibility where we can think in terms of categories and laws. We can think in terms of oneness and diversity. Why? Because that's how God created the world. And God himself, in his nature, is both one and plural. He is three and he is one. So, oneness and diversity is solved in the biblical worldview. It doesn't need to be a perplexing philosophical problem. Finally, let's talk about mind and matter. Okay. Is mind an illusion? Is the self an illusion because we need to be good materialists? Or is matter ultimately an illusion and really all matter is mental? Or should we be idealists? Should we be monists? Should we all become Hindus or New Age thinkers? No. In the biblical worldview, mind and matter are both explained by the eternal power of God. We don't need to be panpsychics, meaning we think that mind is in everything, nor do we need to be Sam Harrisites and say that the self or the mind is ultimately an illusion, because mind and matter were both created by the eternal power of God. God can create matter, whatever matter is. John Frame thinks that there is no fundamental particle. I'm inclined to agree, because I don't know that it makes any sense to think of the parts without the whole. I don't think it makes sense to think in terms of tiny little parts, Higgs bosons, that make up me, my body, without thinking of the body, my body itself, me, who I am. I don't think it makes sense to think of the parts without thinking of the whole. And so God, by his eternal power, is able to create and has created our human minds and matter, real matter, which is, according to scripture, upheld by the power of his word. So God made human persons in his image, and he created the material world as a theater for his glory. Now, these terms, eternal power and divine nature, where does this all come from? It all comes from Romans 1:20. In Romans 1:20, it says that God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what God has made. It says his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood in what God has made. God's eternal power and divine nature are the key to understanding the cosmos. It's all right there in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So scripture says that God's eternal power and divine nature are how we ought to make sense and answer the question of what is really real. All right, now let's look at some non-biblical alternatives as we bring this to a close. And we'll look at three of them: materialism, monism, and Unitarian monotheism. All right, let's start with materialism. In materialism, matter and energy are all that exists. James N. Anderson, in his book, What's Your Worldview, says this about materialism. Quote, everything that exists consists of nothing but matter and energy. Everything is governed by the basic laws of physics and, in principle, can be completely explained in terms of those physical laws. Every object is a purely physical object. Every event that occurs has a purely physical cause, if it has any cause at all. In short, the universe is just a collection of clumps of matter following the laws of physics, end quote. So, materialism denies the creation-creator distinction, and it cannot account for necessary laws or contingent matter. Ultimately, it can't explain where everything came from, because matter is all there is, and matter can't create itself. Although they do believe, many of them do believe, that science will ultimately, in the end, be able to account for this. Materialism cannot account for oneness. It can't account for immaterial laws and categories. Remember, when we're talking about oneness, we're talking about unifying principles. But if everything is ultimately reducible to blobs of matter, their laws are not made of matter. Laws are unchanging. Matter changes all the time. And finally, materialism can't really account for mind, personhood, self. So Sam Harris is wrong when he asserts that the material world is all there is, but he's right when he says that atheism and materialism cannot account for the reality of the self. Okay, so that's one unbiblical alternative to the biblical worldview, materialism. Okay, what about monism? Monism, according to James Anderson, says this: everything is ultimately one. Nothing that exists is really distinct from anything else that exists, which is just to say that in the final analysis, only one thing exists. And that one thing, call it the universe, reality, the one, or whatever you like, cannot be divided or decomposed into more fundamental parts or constituents. End quote. So monism, this is getting at the holism that John Frame was talking about earlier, thinking of things in terms of the whole. Well, it denies the creation-creator distinction again, because it doesn't allow for there to be a creator and his creation. Everything is one. Everything is one. In fact, in the Hindu worldview, man, the human soul, Atman, is Brahman, the oversoul. God is one with creation, so to speak, to put it in Christian terms. So it denies the creation-creator distinction, cannot explain why there is contingent matter or plurality, because all distinctions that we seem to observe in the world are actually illusions. They are Maya in the Hindu worldview. They are illusions. And so this ends up denying personhood. Atman is Brahman, is a core doctrine. That means, and ultimately what we want in this worldview, in the Hindu worldview, for example, is we want to be released from this world of distinctions, and we want to be reabsorbed into Brahman, like a droplet of water being reabsorbed into the ocean. The self is ultimately denied in that worldview. And then finally, the third unbiblical worldview, which we should look at as an alternative, is Unitarian Monotheism. Now, this is going to be the one that's closest to home for us, but there's going to be some important differences. This is Jehovah's Witness theology. This is Islam. This is modern day rabbinical Judaism. And so let's tackle Islam, because it's a great example of this type of worldview. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but there are enough similarities. I think we can speak in terms of similarities here. Islam believes that Allah is the creator of the world and sustains it. So there is a creator-creation distinction to a certain degree, to an important degree. Peter Jones, in his book, The Other Worldview, says this about Judaism and Islam. It says, Judaism and Islam have a defective view of biblical twoism. So Peter Jones talks a lot about oneism and twoism. All is one, all is two, which we would be twoists in his scheme because we recognize a creation-creator distinction. But their denial of the Trinity, Jones says, leaves them with a transcendent yet impersonal God, an attempt at twoism, who ultimately depends upon his relationship with human beings in order to constitute his personhood, which ends up in oneism by a circuitous route. In other words, God, in a Unitarian scheme, has no interpersonal interaction or relation at all until he creates. But interpersonality is so vital to personhood that that God in this scheme actually relies on his creation for aspects of his personhood. God can't be loving until he creates someone to love in this view. So there is a kind of creation-creator distinction, but it makes God dependent on his, ultimately ends up denying the creation-creator distinction because it makes God it denies God's self-sufficiency, which is an important part of the creation-creator distinction. So morality, for example, kind of goes out the window, doesn't it? The necessarily existent laws of morality. It's always wrong to murder, for example. It's always wrong to steal. It's wrong to bear false witness about somebody. These are laws that would require God to create before they would have any meaning. So it really does make God dependent on his creation for these laws. Further, the laws of logic And that creates a real problem for Unitarian monotheism. Why? Because the laws of logic are at least three. I like to think of the laws of logic in terms of three. I think there are three real laws of logic. And these three laws of logic must exist. They exist necessarily. Well, before God created the world, he was the only thing that existed. And so if God is a radical monad, if he has radical oneness, how were the laws of logic, which are three, how were they grounded in a God who is only and solely one? The God of modern rabbinical Judaism and the God of Islam and the God of the Jehovah's Witnesses cannot ground three laws of logic, which all exist necessarily, because there is no plurality in his being. So again, God is required to create before logic can be meaningful, and yet logic exists necessarily. So it does affirm a type of creator-creation distinction, but ultimately ends up denying it in the final analysis. And then it does affirm, however, mind and matter. It does affirm that distinction, but again, there are aspects of our own personality which are interpersonal. So God does not have those characteristics. And so it would make no sense to say that we are made in the image of God, which creates a real problem for, biblical, for Judaism, for example, which claims to believe the Old Testament and yet says that we are made in the image of God, and yet we have an interpersonal experience and nature. But God himself does not have that in the Unitarian scheme. So in conclusion, non-biblical worldviews try hard but ultimately fail to account for the way reality ultimately really is. They can't adequately answer the question, what is really real? This isn't because reality is that hard to explain. It's not like we can say, well, you know what, you tried hard, but ultimately, reality's tough. Reality's tough to explain. No, God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. Scripture is very clear on that. Instead, unbiblical thinking is guilty. We are guilty for denying what God has made obvious to us in his creation. And ultimately, our thinking will never be set right until we understand the key to the cosmos, which is not to examine creation in response to itself or in relation to itself, but to consider all the cosmos, both sum and part, in relation to its creator. Okay. So that concludes the content portion of session 2. Now, here's how this is going to work. Okay. I'm looking, we do have people who are watching this online, and I'm glad. Thank you for watching. I also have 78 comments right now on YouTube. Thank you for your comments. We are not going to get to those comments in this session. So I hate to disappoint you, but the fact of the matter is this is a course. There are guys taking the course right now. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to bring those guys out onto the screen, and we're going to tackle these questions that they've been posting in the private chat, and we're going to get it now into a Q&A time. So, guys, let me bring you back on, and we will dig into these questions. Okay. Let's see. So first question is going to go to Nick. Nick, why don't you go ahead and unmute, and you can ask that first question, and then I'll do my best to answer.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing that popped in my head was, it seems like most people go happily along not caring how to answer these three problems that you presented. Seems like people are just busy with their day-to-day lives and not very concerned with it. But could you answer, why should they care?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. Most people aren't going around asking these deep, fundamental philosophical questions about prime reality. It's just the nature of life. I mean, we've got kids to bring to gymnastics and karate and homeschooling lessons to prepare, and we've got PTA meetings. We're busy. We've got jobs. We're not thinking about these things. Why does it matter? Well, first of all, just because you never think of something doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking of it. I'll never forget when my wife and I visited the doctor because she had a lump on her neck, and we visit. I don't know. I forget. It was I guess it was a oncologist who we visited, maybe ear, nose, and throat first. But I remember when we got the diagnosis back, and they said, "Your wife has thyroid cancer." It threw me for a loop. I mean, I felt like my entire world was being shaken. I'll say this, by the time we got into the doctor, we thought it could be cancer, but we didn't know. But up to that point, we had no idea. Matter of fact, that previous summer, we went back and looked at photographs, and there was this event we were at. It was an air show. We had photographs of the air show, of us at the air show, and then if you look carefully at my wife's neck, you can see that there was a lump there. But this was back in August, and she was diagnosed not until the next winter. And that problem was there, even though we weren't thinking about it. It was growing, threatening her life without our knowledge. So this idea that just because you aren't thinking about something, and Nick, I know this is not what you're saying, but you're exactly right. People have this mentality. Just because I'm not thinking of something, it's not important. No, it's important, which is why you need to think about it. Because these questions of ultimate reality, these are not esoteric questions that have no bearing on your day-to-day life. Because the question of ultimate reality is ultimately a question about God and your relationship to him. As Christians, we understand this, but it just so happens the Christian worldview, the biblical worldview, is the true worldview. That means that questions of ultimate reality are life and death questions, even more important than do I have thyroid cancer or not. The question of where did I come from? Who made me? What is my life? What is my personhood made of? I mean, these seem like philosophical questions, and to an extent they are, but they're asked by Joe Rogan on his podcast, Lex Friedman on his podcast. If you listen to Nick Bostrom and his simulation theory, they're getting into this. What is reality? Can I trust the world around me? And this is that's sort of where like philosophy meets pop culture. But people are asking these questions. So for any Christian to go, well, my neighbor's not asking these questions, you might be surprised. He might be listening to Nick Bostrom and buying into simulation hypothesis. You never know. And at least as a Christian, that these questions do have eternal significance. God did create your neighbor. God does require something of your neighbor. God did make your neighbor to know him, to know God. The Bible does say that eternal life is knowing God and Jesus Christ. So these are very important questions. They have life or death. They actually have eternal significance. So the fact that they're not thinking about it means that you and I need to raise the issue.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess it is up to us to some degree to try to, if they're not thinking about it, try to work it in conversations to draw it out and to at least get them thinking or talking about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for your question, Nick.
Mm.
Okay, Brian, I think you had the next question.
Excuse me. No, it was it was actually in response to Nick.
I see it.
My question's further down.
I see it. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, you did have a question. So go ahead, and you've already unmuted yourself. So let's just go with it.
Sure. So my question was, how can the naturalist and or materialist account for the laws of logic?
Well, ultimately they can't. There are different attempts that they will use. In my experience, I've heard different things like logic is just merely a convention. So it's something that we've all sort of agreed to, which gives it no weight and no obligation, there's no oughtness to it. If it's just a convention, in our culture, don't we celebrate those who go against convention? I mean, every Disney movie for the last 25 years is the princess who bucks tradition, who bucks convention. This is just conventional, well, then our culture values bucking convention. And so the best thing you could be would be to be illogical. So there goes any atheist objection to Christianity being illogical. But ultimately, no one really lives that way. Like logic is merely a convention. In fact, it's actually impossible to live that way. Because if logic is just a convention, then our world actually is illogical and logic itself is false. No one lives that way. It's impossible to live in this world as if logic is not real. Without getting into that whole, there's a whole argument. Actually, I have an article on my website, thethink.institute, that says I think it's called 6 Reasons Why Logic is Not Merely a Human Convention. So that might be worth checking out. But they'll say logic is an emergent property of matter. When you get a bunch of matter together, it just behaves logically. Sort of logic is just something that arises from it, which again is that property made of matter itself? Is the property material? No, that doesn't make any sense. It's a property. It's a mental construct. As we're looking at something, we describe it in terms of its properties, but there's a mental immaterial aspect to a property that can't be explained purely in terms of material reality. They'll say we don't need to account for it. That's one of my favorites. Well, we don't need to account for it. It's just the way things are. Okay, well, I don't need to account for God. God's just there. Good luck. Tally ho. Take care. Have a great life. God's just there. I mean, we're not going to come up with arguments anymore? That's just how we're living life? Okay. See you in Disneyland, We just don't care about explaining things more. Fine. It still doesn't, even if you say that's just the way the world works, we're still talking about immaterial laws that are not made of matter. And if all you believe in is matter and energy, then you actually can't believe in immaterial logical laws. Even if you just say that's just the way things are, you actually can't say that. You literally have 2 separate worldviews going on. So, in short or shorter, Brian, they cannot account for logic. There have been many attempts. It's impossible. You can't do it. They have to steal from us, steal from God. Okay. Does that answer your question? Cool. All right. Andrew, I believe you are up, sir. You're muted.
Okay. Got it. I think you actually may have answered the question in the lecture, but can you explain the difference between a triune God and a monad?
Yes. Yeah, I think I did somewhat hit on it in the lecture, but ultimately it's a question of internal plurality to God's nature. So the idea of a monad, to me, I see all these philosophical problems with it that I'm not sure I can prove, but it seems to me like a pure monad, a truly Unitarian concept of God, couldn't really have any attributes at all. Everything would have to be complete oneness. So it wouldn't even make sense to call God he, or even really it. How could you even describe God at all, actually? As a matter of fact, when we're talking about, the Muslim conception of God, Allah, God in their religion is supposed to be ineffable, meaning you cannot describe Allah. Of course, the problem with that is that is a description. Calling God ineffable, indescribable, you are describing him. That's an attribute. And the Quran makes all kinds of descriptions about Allah. But there are other problems. A monad cannot be interpersonal without creating. I'm not even sure how a monadic concept of God can create anything distinct from himself. A God like that couldn't even be self-reflective, because that requires a certain sort of internal plurality, me, myself, and I kind of thing. Self-reflection seems to me to require a certain kind of internal plurality. You might say, well, but I'm not a Trinity and I can describe myself. That's true, but you are made in the image of God. And God is internally plural. He is three and one. So if we're made in the image of God, it would make sense that we can perform things like self-reflection, that sort of thing. But in our world, if you were to just look out at the world, and I have this theory, I've never fully fleshed it out, but I've articulated it on different podcast episodes of my podcast, the Think Podcast, available on 11 different platforms, whichever favorite podcast catcher you choose to use. You can go to thethink.institute/podcast. But I've articulated this, and here's what I think. I think if you look at the world, Andrew, I think I have this idea. General revelation would be enough to get you to a triune God. The laws of logic alone, I think, testify to the fact that God is triune, because there are three necessarily existent laws of logic. They must exist in every possible world. God must exist. By definition, God must exist in every possible world. That's sort of a ontological argument for God. The laws of logic are mental entities. They're propositions. James Anderson talks about this on a recent episode of Capturing Christianity. They are mental entities which must exist in a mind. So they exist necessarily. God exists necessarily. They must be grounded in God's mind. But there are three of them. So they can only be rooted in a God who has plurality within himself. And that God, because God has to account for three laws of logic, that God does not need to have any more than three persons in his nature, because that's just multiplying persons unnecessarily. So the sufficient and necessary explanation of the laws of logic are a triune God. So I don't know that you could get Father, Son, and Holy Spirit per se without special revelation. But if I have this idea that in our unfallen state, if God had never revealed himself to be triune, I think we could still get there, which is like totally hypothetical. Like that's not the way this world actually is. But that's my theory. So yeah, a monadic God, it doesn't account for reality. Any other questions, thoughts, anything else that came up, anything you guys want to push back on, or seek clarification on?
You kind of touched on it already, so I kind of rephrased my next little question there. But I guess since a materialist worldview excludes surrounding necessary laws, like universal, abstract, absolute, and they seem to be totally fine or just completely disregard that they can't ground it and just move on. And that seems to be frustrating. When I watch your debate with Tom Jump, he seemed to just push right by it and move along in the debate. But I mean, that's pretty frustrating, I guess, for you, or it seems like they either don't see it or they don't want to see it. Respond to that.
Yeah. Well, it's Romans 1. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all the ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. What has been God's invisible attributes have been clearly seen. His eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being perceived in the things that have been made. I'm misquoting that. But the only possible way to get through life in any kind of coherent way without acknowledging God, without glorifying him as Lord or giving him thanks, which are the two things that God says in Romans 1 that we don't do apart from Christ. This is why God's wrath is being revealed, because we don't acknowledge God as Lord, we don't glorify him as Lord, and we don't give him thanks. If you're going to live your life in God's world without acknowledging him and thanking him, there's just certain things you can't acknowledge. You just can't go there. Can't do it. I can't think about my own sin. Nick, really, I mean, think as Christians, think about your sin, and it is horrific. It's terrifying to think about as a Christian, to think what Jesus had to die for in our own lives, It's like, oh, I don't even want to go there as a Christian. I mean, I have to confess that and thank the Lord Jesus for dying for my sins. But can you imagine trying to deal with your own sin apart from Christ? It'd be like looking directly into the sun. It'd burn your eyes out. It's God's glory and magnificence and holiness apart from faith in Jesus Christ are terrifying. And an atheist, if he's going to try to live autonomously in God's world, there's certain doors you can't open because those doors lead directly to God. And I don't see how you get around it. I think logic, morality, the preconditions of science, the intelligibility of the universe, meaning, love, these are things, why do atheists love to try to reduce love down to chemical reactions? Every now and then there are these articles that come out in Time and Newsweek. We finally figured out love is just a chemical reaction. Come on. Love is not even if there are chemical reactions associated with it, we all know that love, there's this transcendency to love. And this is acknowledged by Hollywood. It's, it's acknowledged in our culture. No one sings songs about chemical reactions, great, beautiful ballads, poetry. That's not what inspires the great works of art. We know that love is real, but when you acknowledge true self-sacrificing love, that is a door that leads directly to the transcendent, that leads directly to God. So we have to say, well, it's just a chemical reaction. We have to reduce everything down to its parts, because maybe then if I go deeper and deeper, I can avoid God. But guess what? You go down to the deeper and deeper, when you look at things from a microscopic level, you get down to its constituent parts. Guess what they're calling the Higgs boson, which they say is the particle that gives everything mass. They call it the God particle. Isn't that funny? You get down, you go deeper and deeper and deeper, and you end up still with this transcendent language about God. Because we all, in our heart of hearts, we're trying to suppress him and we can't. So yes, I agree with you. They move on and it's frustrating. And this is why, as loving Christian friends, we need to hold their feet to the fire as much as we can without being unloving about it. But we need to, because it is a matter of life and death. Any other thoughts, questions on that? Okay. All right. Well, let's end our broadcast here, and we're going to go backstage and we're going to talk about the rest of our class, the challenge and the other things that we talk about. If you've been watching, and I've had 32 more comments roll in, man, Michael Hudson is on a roll. Michael, you get the participation trophy because you're I haven't looked at all your questions yet, but you've given me a lot of them. So thank you for your participation. Thanks for watching. This is where we're going to end our broadcast. And again, if you want to know more about the Think Institute and the Hammer and Anvil Society, let me just encourage you to go to thethink.institute, and you can get all the wonderful information there. Also, if you have been benefited and blessed by the Think Institute and the work that we do, let me invite you to consider partnering with us through prayer and by financial means. We are missionaries. I'm a missionary, fully supported by the generous contributions, tax-free contributions, I might add, of like-minded individuals and families. So you can find out more about that by going to thethink.institute/partner. I am a missionary. I would love to be your missionary. Thethink.institute/partner. Okay, thanks a lot. This is where we're going to sign off. God bless you all. And remember, this is not goodbye. This has just been a little pit stop along the way of your spiritual journey. Until next time, I hope it made you think.